Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to Joss and her colleagues for inviting me. In 1779, Hugo Arnott, the historian of Edinburgh, praised Robert Adams' design for the Register Office, which he said excels the ideas we form of it from the plan, unlike his other buildings. And he declared, though unfinished, it is perhaps the handsomest building in the nation. I won't quarrel with this judgment, but I leave the evolution of Adams' building for Tony Lewis to address in this room later this month. Register House or Register Office, these are interchangeable terms. I probably use them both tonight. A Register Office, as it was understood in the 18th century, was a place where you would go and find a servant to hire or to be hired. But it has come to have this other archival meaning, and General Register House or General Register Office was the term used at the time. Today I want to examine some of the key questions about looking at the phase before Robert Adams designed the building that was to become Register House. Why was it built? How was the scheme taken forward? Who was involved? Where was it to be built, crucially? And when did all this happen? Of course, much has been written about the history of the new town, not least by A.J. Youngson in his classic account, The Making of Classical Edinburgh, as well as various other studies of Register House history by H.M. Peyton in 1930, Athol Murray in 1974, and by others. But I would like to suggest that the Register House project before Adam is important in three ways. Firstly, for the influence it had on the actual building that now stands here, the way in which it interweaves with the development of the new town itself, and the broader developments in Scotland. The overall story is well known. The key dates I'm giving you here, beginning in 1752, when there's published proposals for carrying on public works, which leads to an Act of Parliament the following year. This proposal stemmed from a recognition by the Convention of Royal Boroughs that it was desirable to create accommodation both for themselves but also the courts and the public records. And an Act of Parliament followed next year, which led ultimately to the new town being formed. In 1760, the Earl of Morton is appointed Lord Clerk Register, who's the public official in charge of the public records. 5 years later, there's a grant of £12,000 from the forfeited estates, which is to be put to building of a repository. And a group of trustees is appointed that year to oversee the project. 67, James Craig, his plan for the new town is approved. In 1769, the current site here at the north end of the North Bridge is agreed between the Register House trustees and the town council. And the trustees decide to look for persons of skill, as they called it, to be the architects. 1772, Robert and James Adam, the brothers, are appointed as architects, and their design for the Register Office is approved. 2 years later, as Joss has said, in June 1774, the foundation stone of this building is laid. Building work is suspended for a few years when funds ran out, and this is when the famous quip by William Creech, the bookseller, that the Register House was the most magnificent pigeon house in Europe, was made. 1788, the building was opened after staff started to move in from late 1787 onwards, and the flitting of the records took a few years, and it wasn't finished until 1791. But why was a Register House needed? Perhaps the most important fact to remember about Scotland's public records in the mid-18th century was that they were, generally speaking, in poor condition and without a single home. A large number, such as the Quarter Session records, the Sacenes and older Exchequer records, were stored in the Lake Parliament Hall below the Parliament House off the High Street, and others were scattered across the Old Town in offices and dwellings. The Lake Parliament Hall was merely the basement apartments below the Parliament Hall of 1631. Their convenience, the convenience of this space was for the nearness to the law courts, which are just occupied part of the ground floor space here, as you can see in the engraving. But that was their only virtue, for they were damp and cramped spaces, even the rats and other vermin that infested the hall were not able to eat their way fast enough through the accumulating records deposited there by the officials of various government offices. In 1715, there was a petition for money to pay for a cat to keep down the rats and mice, which had greatly damnified, eaten and destroyed the records in the Exchequer House. The town council, which had been responsible since 1662 for maintaining the premises, was latterly only paying enough for a fire to be lit in one of the rooms of the Lake Hall. And it was said that particularly after rain, water ran down the walls and there was inadequate shelving. Around 1760, one of the underkeepers complained that the records are suffering sensibly and many of them will be rendered useless unless a more commodious place be built for their preservation. Well, the government official responsible for the records, as we've mentioned, was the Lord Clarke Register, whose lineage goes back to William of Dumfries, Clerk of the Rolls, around 1180. And after this, various Clarke registers, or Clerk's Register, I should say, and their own clerks had made sporadic and often ineffectual attempts to remedy the problems of space and poor accommodation. In 1722, Edinburgh Town Council passed an Act for civic improvements, which included provision for a hall for keeping the records under the charge of the Lord Clarke Register, as well as a space for the Justiciary Court. And they secured an act in Parliament, but it failed to take effect. In 1752, as we've noted, the Convention of Royal Boroughs published ambitious proposals for an exchange building in Parliament Close, which would incorporate a borough room for their own use, rooms for Edinburgh Town Council and various public offices, including what were called proper apartments for the public registers, as well as the Advocates' Library. However, the exchange, which is now the City Chambers, was made the priority, and when completed around 1760, did not include spaces for the registers and records. So perhaps the biggest single factor in the decades of procrastination was the town's failure to deliver on its proposal, as there were always more pressing calls on its finances, which is a familiar story, of course. In the context of this failure at local level, it came as a fresh initiative that government itself should undertake to help fund the desired special repository. Government ministers cannot have been unaware that Scotland's historic public records had been protected under Clause 24 of the Act of Union of 1707, which declared that they should remain in Scotland in all time coming. So creating a proper place to keep the records safe was therefore arguably not only a practical good, but also a matter of salving national pride. The 1752 proposals phrased it as the accommodations still wanting to the courts of justice, the royal boroughs, and the Town Council of Edinburgh are so plainly a national concern that to enlarge on them is unnecessary. The appointment of James Douglas, the 14th Earl of Morton, as Clarke Register in September 1760, he's the one sitting on the left here, as you probably gathered in Davidson's portrait here. His appointment signalled the beginnings of a change in the way the condition of the public records was treated. It's not clear why he was given the lucrative post. Certainly he was in favour with the influential 3rd Duke of Argyll, who dominated Scottish politics at this date. Morton had been one of the many commissioners appointed to manage the annexed Jacobite estates after 1755, but being based in London, he had not attended a single meeting. Despite this, it was clear that he was a very capable man, committed to public service. As one of Scotland's 16 representative peers, he spoke often in the House of Lords, and he had long held scientific interests. He assisted in the growth of the Medical Society of Edinburgh into the Society for Improving Arts and Sciences. In 1740, he was helping establish an observatory in Edinburgh University. He was one of the first trustees of the British Museum, and in 1764 was elected to the prestigious post of President of the Royal Society. So during his term of office, the Society assumed management of the Greenwich Observatory, and Morton keenly promoted astronomical activities. His interests made him a natural choice to serve on the Board of Longitude, which famously oversaw the attempt to establish an accurate marine navigational system and made awards to John Harrison and others. As a Commissioner of Longitude, he secured funds to pay for the expedition to Tahiti under Captain Cook to observe the transit of Venus. Morton was indeed a man of ability and influence, and as we shall see, a very determined character. How did he approach his responsibilities as Clarke Register? Well, it's clear that he did not treat his post as a sinecure, as many of his predecessors had. He seemed keen to actually earn some of the £1,200 in fees he received yearly. In 1761, he personally made a thorough inspection not only of the Lake Parliament Hall, but of all the offices in Edinburgh where records were being kept or created. And it's worth quoting a few examples here. The Court of Session clerks, who among other duties kept legal registers, occupied several separate offices. Jury's office occupied a house in the Lawn Market, not necessarily the one I'm showing here, but in one of the houses up on the Upper Lawn Market. And through a cracked timber partition which screened his house from a dwelling on the same level, the Lord Clerk Register could distinctly hear women talking and children crying. Similarly, the clerks of Dalrymple's office occupied a house in the Lucken Booths beside St Giles. From the upstairs neighbour's kitchen, it was reported, water often runs down through the ceiling upon the writings. So even before some records arrived in the Lake Parliament Hall, they were water damaged. Next one, please. Meanwhile, the Sacian office was in the Deputy Clerk's house at the entry of Milnes Square. I've just used this as a generic image. You could just ignore everything on the right, but just wanted to convey the kind of tangle of houses that led off the high street where these officials lived and conducted their business. This place where the Sacian office was in Milnes Square, overhead are several stories occupied by private families, several of whom take in lodgers, and immediately underneath is a brandy shop and alehouse. The Chancery Office, being housed in the Parliament Close, which we've already seen, did not make its accommodation any more secure. Overhead, it was reported, are rooms belonging to the Chancellor of Exchequer, but immediately underneath is the shop and furnace of a silversmith. In the same close, Court of Session officials had private neighbours above, but worked above a coffee shop and 2 taverns. There was obviously a considerable alarm that so many places were at risk of fire breaking out below them. Having seen the parlous state of the premises in which the record officials worked and the records were kept, a memorial on the subject was sent to government in 1762. It mentioned, to strengthen the case, that a fire had destroyed the Teind office and all its records a few years before. And it suggested very reasonably that a fire affecting the records of the Court of Session would be far worse, because in those offices are kept writings of all kinds that are in process, title deeds to estates, bonds and bills for money, and various other deeds, the loss of which would occasion the ruin of many families. This is an alarming consideration for every man of property in that part of the kingdom. And the memorial concluded, from the account of the records, it appears how necessary it is for the security of property in Scotland that they should be disposed of in another manner than they are at present. So we're getting a clue here about Morton's interest in the records. Maintaining the written evidence of property rights, I should say, was a fundamental purpose of the public registers, then as now. The public registers formed part of the bedrock of a society whose political institutions were founded on property ownership. No member of the political classes in Scotland, or indeed south of the border, would have needed to be reminded about that. The Register of the Great Seal, the registers of Sacians and so forth, preserved the written evidence of property possession and therefore of political enfranchisement. The Court of Session adjudicated in disputes relating to these rights, and its registers and records were a further point of record. So the creation of a secure and modern register office could be seen as a necessity, given that the records themselves were now shown to be under physical threat. The next one. It seems reasonable to assume that in aiming to secure the preservation of the records, Morton wanted to serve the public good by a well-directed scheme of improvement. He was not content merely to ascertain the extent of the challenges posed by the dire condition of the records, but he actively addressed the practicalities of record keeping. Having made his inspection in 1761, the following year he drew together his ideas in the form of a draft scheme for a repository or archive building, which we see here, which was subsequently translated into an architectural design by Robert Baldwin in 1767. And I refer to it perhaps as the Morton-Baldwin plan. As you can see, it's a square enclosing a central hall consisting of one main story, we'll see that in a moment in the elevation, over a basement. The principal floor is taken up by a suite of offices around the side, lit by windows to the outside elevations. And the rooms are carefully labelled with the names of the intended occupants. The legal officials and the clerks of the Court of Session are prominent, and related offices are provided for Chancery, Great Seal and Privy Seal, and the Exchequer. There are offices for all 6 of the principal clerks of session, arranged in 3 pairs, there, and there. And several other bodies, such as the Commissary Office and the Justiciary Office, are accommodated in pairs of offices on the North Range. At the centre of the building, the General Register, which is a series of unheated storage rooms here. At the centre is a room with tables for inspecting and extracting of writs. And this appears to be provision for public access to the records and the creation or delivery of extract copies, which is a function that obviously continues to this day. The title General Register corresponds to the 1762 memorial describing the records in the Lake Parliament Hall. They included some old Privy Council registers and some other public registers, as we've mentioned. The reference to extracting of writs suggests that the space was also perhaps intended for legal records, perhaps the Court of Session, and possibly Sessions also. And the next one. The offices and storage rooms are fitted with vents, which can be seen more clearly in this section here. You can see these little apertures at the tops of the storage compartments there. Morton described this as being, it's so contrived that supposing through carelessness a fire should catch in any one of the cells, it would blow out at the top window in the top and could not possibly communicate itself to any other part of the building. And the roof is so contrived that a great number of hands might be present at the same time to give their assistance, which could not be practicable in a structure of any other form, especially where stairs are introduced. So it's not quite clear whether he's expecting somehow things to be hauled out of the windows at the top. In the case of a fire, I'm not really sure what he means there. No timber was to be used in the building, and the doors were to be of cast iron. And this foreshadows the very restricted use of wooden flooring in Adam's design. In fact, the only wooden floor in this building is in this room. Let me get the plan. It's striking how the overall arrangements of the Morton-Baldwin plan resemble Adam's final design, which, as you, I think, know, and I don't have a picture to show you, ironically, is a rectangle enclosing a rotunda. But a rotunda has got storage compartments in it and a central saloon, which some of you will be familiar with the wonderful ceiling on it. But essentially, the outside is only one room thick, but it's a very similar functional space. So this is really a kind of a square version of what Adam expanded upon when he came to do his design. It's not a functioning architectural design, however. If we can just go back briefly. The dome, the drum, and the dome's got to sit on a strong structure. If we go along to the next one. But you can see here there's actually no provision, architecturally speaking, for anything very substantial. This is a classic problem of a drum sitting on a square building, and it needs huge walls, and it's very difficult to reconcile the straight and the round, apart from the load bearing. So, not a practical design, but very much designed to impress on the viewer that these different offices are being catered for. In other words, the accommodation needs of the different offices are being carefully thought about. There are various other impractical aspects to this, but which needn't detain us, but we could go into later on. So we should perhaps look at the purpose behind the design. We'll come back to the purpose behind the design in 1767. Meanwhile, the memorial has made the case for the threat to the public records and for something to be done about it. Morton was actively seeking funding, and he hoped to obtain a grant from the revenues in the hands of the annexed estates to start work in 1763. He got a grant, well, there was promise of a grant of £3,000 out of an unspent £7,000, but there was delay in getting this, so that kind of lapsed. So the first, in his 1762 memorial, he did think there was the site of some old wooden houses up in the Lawn Market might be a suitable place to place a new building, but that didn't happen. So the first site that he thinks about is down in the Cowgate. In February 1763, he writes to William Muir, a baron of the Exchequer, in other words, the Treasury in Scotland, cautioning him not to divulge the proposed site, which he describes as the only area that can be had for that purpose. For if this circumstance came to be known, there are some persons about the excise who would move heaven and earth to defeat the whole scheme, and rather than want a stateroom for that office, would make a bonfire of all the records at the Cross upon the King's birthday. Excellent. So this is the space that he was interested in. He was describing the area adjoining the excise office in the Cowgate. The excise office is marked L on this plan here. Since 1730, the excise had occupied this former mansion belonging to the Merchant Company, just east of the Magdalen Chapel. The site now lies under the south piers of George IV Bridge, which pretty much ran over just here, straight over there. If we take the dimensions of the Morton-Baldwin plan, which is 157 feet square, it more or less fits in the area marked here as a bowling green. It doesn't quite, but it's more or less does fit in. But the green was owned by the Merchant Company, who'd created it when they bought the whole property in 1691. So it seems that this was Morton's site, and it was open to offers. In July 1764, Morton commended to Muir the plan he had prepared for the building, which we've just been looking at. It had been thoroughly considered by very able artists, and its simplicity meant it was the cheapest option. He had secured support for funding from the Secretary for the Northern Department, George Grenville, and was pressing his colleagues to buy the site. The Lord Privy Seal, one of the government officials in Scotland, wrote to Muir saying, "Let me know likewise what is done or doing about the building for the records, for Lord Morton is pressing me about finishing the purchase of his darling piece of ground, and if the session rises and everybody runs away now before anything is concluded, I shall be plagued to death about it." Meanwhile, Muir and others had visited and assessed potential sites. Morton, at home in distant Chiswick, understood there to have been unanimous consent that the plot next to the excise office was the only proper situation, and he therefore professed inexpressible surprise and concern on learning that an alternative site was being thought of. So site number 2. The old borough room, which is somewhere south of Parliament Close, and it's probably one of these buildings here. It's described as ruinous, and it's near the Meal Market, which is marked here. And this is a steeply sloping site, as you'll appreciate. This was the area that was being suggested. It was an awkward site, partly covered by the semi-ruinous former borough premises and other ground right down to the southern slope down to the Cowgate. Morton explained that he had very material objections, but both with respect to convenience and security. His main objection to the cramped site is very interesting because he realised that the offices would have to be built one above the other. So proper security from fire for all the different records would not be possible. And he emphasised that all of them are of great importance to the community. And he took the opportunity to spell out some of the advantages of his own design. Test boring of the ground at this alternative site was carried out. The builders reported that the boring, piling and planking that would be necessary to support a building would cost no less than £2,650 sterling. The Lord Privy Seal commented that this was an immense sum by way of preparation for building, so that I am afraid we must lay aside thoughts of that ground for the purpose. Doubtless this was a great relief to Morton, who was still determined on an open site for his single-storey design. So no more is heard of the merchant company site near the excise office either, for reasons which remain obscure. So in March 1765, Morton was busy with his Board of Longitude business, but perhaps also with Register House affairs. He wrote, rather generally, "I've been harassed out of my life for a good while past, and I'm afraid shall be so for some time to come, and get nothing but pains for my trouble, except the satisfaction of doing the community service." Although we don't know the details, it's likely that Morton's persistent promotion of the Register House helped prompt a sympathetic government to arrange for a royal warrant dated 20th of June 1765, appointing Register House trustees. It was standard government practice to appoint leading men to serve such projects, but this was an exceptionally high-powered body drawn from the stratum of elite men which dominated public administration, law and politics in Scotland, and often exercised huge patronage powers. In addition to the Lord Clerk Register himself, were the Keepers of the Great Seal and the Privy Seal, the Lord Justice General, the Chief Baron of Exchequer, who headed the Scottish finances, and last but not least, the Court of Session, Lord President of the Court of Session, Robert Dundas of Arniston, the head of a distinguished legal dynasty. The Lord Privy Seal, it's worth mentioning, was James Stuart Mackenzie, who was the younger brother of the Earl of Bute, who had not long before been Prime Minister. In other words, the Register House trustees included most of the leading officials and represented many of the administrative areas whose officials and records would find a home in the planned Register House. The trustees were to have this £12,000 unspent from the revenues of the forfeited estates. This was far more than the 3,000 which Morton had hoped for in just 2 years before. But it needs to be seen against a background of government investment in Scotland after the 45 Rising, such as an important bridge at Perth and the projected Forth Clyde Canal. But the large sum of £12,000 reflects the likely expense of buying suitable ground, now that the expansion of Edinburgh was under discussion. Next. We come to our third site. Against a background of speculation and negotiation about the developments, Morton and his fellow trustees renewed their search for a site. They were still intent on a site within the ancient liberties of the city, and in August they decided to enter into negotiations with the governors of Heriot's Hospital to view a site in the northwest corner of the garden, which is this space here. The site, they believed it was the only site large enough to which was unencumbered with buildings, and Morton was to have drawings and estimates made of the proposed building. They soon met the trustees and showed the governors their plans of the ground and of the building. As Peyton noted, Morton had his plans well thought out beforehand. And it's very likely that the plan he showed the governors was his 1762 design in manuscript at that point, or something very similar. All started well. The governors agreed to view the site to the trustees, but opposition to the site soon flared up. The influential Society of Writers to His Majesty's Signet objected because it lay too far for convenient access to the Court of Session. Nothing illustrates the compact nature of pre-expansion Edinburgh better than the objections to a proposal to site a public building 620 yards from the centre of legal business. But in November 1765, the Deputy Keeper of the Signet told the trustees in person that his brethren the writers were extremely sensible of the honour done them by the trustees in asking their opinion in a matter of so great consequence, not only to their society, but the nation. But for their part, the trustees expressed themselves that they were apprehensive that inconveniencies may arise from placing the repository for their records in Heriot's garden, which they are desirous to avoid as much as possible. So the lawyers successfully persuaded the trustees to abandon their hopes for this site by the end of the year. So in August 1765, just as the trustees were starting negotiations with their grant of £12,000 being banked, the contract was let for building the bridge across the Nor Loch. You can just make out this this line here, the dark bars represent the run up to the bridge and the arches there. So this was the signal for the start of the new town. In April 1766, as the bridge was being commenced, the town council began a competition to design the new town and issued a survey of the ground on which the town was to stand, the area north of the Norloch. This is a copy of that plan, which is in the Register House plan series here, which obviously belonged to the trustees. It's a printed plan, but it's been very heavily annotated with measurements of ground and rather mysterious digits, which would repay further study. Essentially, Register House is here. This is Moultries or Moultries Hill, just here, at the crest of the hill, just opposite where the bridge was to land. And this, basically this forms the position where the new town is to be built, and Craig's design obviously fills that area with his winning design in August 1766. Although his design was not accepted in full at first, it formed the basis of the plan eventually executed. So the council now had the bridge to ease communications to the area proposed for the new town, with a series of purchases from a patchwork of owners across the site. They owned substantial portions of the ground where the new town would be built. So after abandoning the Heriot site in December 65, at some point the Register House trustees' attention turned to the new town for a possible site. They were to reconvene in February 1766, but if they did, they left no formal record. There's a gap in the minutes of the trustees for 2.5 years, which is very inconvenient. The accepted picture is of one of inaction in the Register House project until after Morton's death in 1768 and the appointment of his successor as Clarke Register. But there's definitely evidence to show that this was not the case and that Morton played an unexpected and indeed unwelcome role during a crucial phase of the new town's development. Having initiated the new town and the connecting bridge, the town council sought to secure an act of parliament extending the boundaries of the royalty of the city. This was to ensure that the proprietors of the new houses would contribute to the city's tax revenues. So they therefore petitioned Parliament for permission to present a bill to Parliament in 24th of January 1767, and it was duly laid before the House. Morton now took an extreme measure amounting to a political gamble. He notified the council that he would petition the House of Commons and against the extension bill unless they agreed to terms of what was called his proposition concerning a site. And the council was warned by their London lawyer that Morton says he was determined to fight every inch of the extension bill. Morton claimed that all the Register House trustees in London had considered and approved his memorial, but the trustees in Scotland declined to sign it. We know this from a letter that Morton wrote to Lord Robert Dundas, Lord President, who you saw just in that portrait. Morton believed that any difficulties could be removed, and he said, "I am sure your lordship is of opinion that some place or other should be provided for keeping the records." But he told also Dundas that he would now use his utmost efforts to obtain a site from the town council. Morton's tactic was to make the council account for its use of revenue from existing beer and ale duties and the 1753 Act for erecting public buildings in Edinburgh. He basically demanded that the council build a timber bridge for foot passengers from the foot of Warriston's close across the Norloch to the ground beyond, grant 2¼ acres of ground to the north of the Norloch for the purposes of building a register office, waive few duties on the ground and make the building free of taxation, and to provide water when it was laid on. Now, he was ignoring the bridge that was being built and proposing a footbridge running somewhere roughly here. It would be landing across roughly, and the Register House would roughly positioned itself on St Andrew's Square, or the west of St Andrew's Square. He was envisioning his register office as a civic building worthy to occupy the site at the central point of the projected new town, in a prominent position at the crest of the ridge. The plot he demanded measured 120 ells, which measures his design that we've already seen. But it's unclear how this relates to the developing plans of the new town, Craig's plans for the new town. And I don't really want to go into this, but happy to take questions or discuss it afterwards. Very complicated sequence of plans, not all of which are dates that appear on them. And they do include a central design, one of them, but where Morton is proposing the Register House to be doesn't correspond in any way to that central circus. The town council may have been surprised by this threat from Morton, the Crown official, whom they'd just admitted an honorary burgess a few months before in September of '66. But they reacted swiftly. They obtained a legal opinion on his claims from one of their assessors, none other than the Solicitor General, a rising star of the Scottish Bar, named Henry Dundas, Robert Dundas's nephew, in fact. He gave a reassuring opinion to the council that Morton had no basis for a claim. There'd been no misapplication of the funds that had been from the beer and ale duties, and there was no obligation on the council after money had been largely spent on the Exchange building and the rest put towards the North Bridge. There was no obligation on the council to fund or to give ground for the Register Office. The council printed Morton's proposition with a paraphrase of his letter or memorial, followed by a long rebuttal of his demands, which was quite robust and almost to the point of rudeness, but this was circulated to all the members of Parliament for Scotland in order to head off any purchase that Morton's arguments might make in Parliament. One of the things they point out is that the distance from the courts is even greater than the previous sites that they've been looking at. In order to also to head off Morton's complaints, they recommended a submission, which was then entered into, and this killed off Morton's attempt to block the passage of the bill. And the council then approved Craig's modified design after the bill went through, and published in January '68 as the basis for viewing plots in the new town. But silence envelops the trustees and transactions at this period. One bit of evidence we do have, of course, is that we've already seen the printed plan. Basically, Morton had his plan, his design for the Register Office, published in March 1767, which was just probably at the time that his objections were being discussed, or were still there in coming to Parliament's notice. So I think that was just his last gasp to try and convince interested parties that his scheme was sound in order to support his case. Anyhow, nothing happens. And I'm just giving you this general view here, just a view from the Castle Hill, which just shows, again, Moutry's Hill here, the Norloch here, obviously, and this is the site where the bridge was to come over from the old town to go across there. So this is a thing from the British Library, a view by Paul Sandby. Right. So on to the next one, please. Sorry. This plan, which is the north end of the North Bridge, tells us that Morton's design of 157 feet square, with a surrounding strip of 40 feet wide, was being considered for two sites. First of all, the present site that eventually happens here, but also across the street where the Balmoral is now. And this is very interesting. There's no, I haven't come across any documentary evidence as to what point this is being discussed, but it clearly presents two alternatives. The advantage of this site, the Balmoral site, if you like, was that the ground belonged to the town. This site doesn't, and you can see a complex set of lettering here to show the different parcels of land, the way they intersect with the overlaid plan for the Register House. So the town eventually has this patch of land here. We'll see that in a plan in a minute. So this plan is also, you may notice, those of you further back, St Giles Street here. This is the name given to Princes Street before, in the early versions of the design. The King expressed disquiet with this because of its associations with St Giles Parish in London, which was not a very reputable kind of place, and so he, at that remark, effectively killed that name off, and it was replaced with the princes. It was named for the princes, the royal princes. So the other thing to note about this plan is I've attributed it to 1767. In the catalogue it's 1770, but this is an area upon the right hand of the bridge, about 200 feet square. By 1770, by 1768 in fact, the theatre had been built here, so this plan has definitely got to be 2 or 3 years earlier than indicated. Now, in December of this year, the current site was not yet agreed upon, and so this plan may just, with Baldwin's architectural design, may be designed to show to the both to the council and to the arbiters that despite their differences, there was a wish to find a practical solution. Morton dies in 1768 before anything further can happen, and a month later is succeeded by Lord Frederick Campbell, brother of the 4th Duke of Argyll, who's the Clarke Register. His portrait is on the wall behind you. The fraught relationship which existed in Morton's time seems to have eased, and it was reported that the Provost, George Drummond, was well disposed to accommodate the trustees with an area for building a repository. In August 1769, the Lord Frederick and other trustees inspected various sites already discussed. I don't quite know why they went back over old ground, but they did. I think it was probably because there was a thought that the situation in the old town was as prescribed by the 1753 Act, and might therefore attract a grant from the city, or grant of land from the city. And they also looked at a couple of new sites on the south side as well. But on the whole, they concluded that the site at the end of the bridge would be the most proper one. So if we can next. This plan shows more, again, quite graphically shows the tangle of buildings at Mutreys Hill, but also the way in which the different property chunks ran, put them like that. But by now, this ground just fronting Princes Street is actually in the hands of the town. So, basically, to cut a long story short, in August 1769, they agree to grant this plot of land. Now, the key event here is that on the 3rd of August, part of the south end of the North Bridge collapsed as it was nearing completion. The council, I think, was very keen to resume and complete the bridge in order to reassure everybody who'd already bought plots in the new town as to that the bridge would be functioning and the new town could proceed as planned. They were obviously concerned to resolve contractual matters as well about the collapse. The North Bridge Committee discussed the Register Office, and they met the trustees, and the Bridge Committee recommended to the council, the full council, that it was the best thing that they could do is to grant some land at the end of the bridge there. So that was effectively agreed. They were still a bit concerned about the distance from the courts to this site, but they were reassured that the distance could be walked at a moderate pace within about 8 minutes. So that was a crucial thing for them to learn. The final thing was the terms on which the council would grant the land. The trustees held out for be granted it free, but also free of annual few duty. And on their part, they conceded that they had no further claim against the council. So that was effectively the key thing which allowed the council to then grant the ground. This plan has got an annotation on the back which explains all the different plots, written by, I think, Alexander Webster, who famous for the 1755 census, who acted in a sort of surveying, consulting capacity for the council. The meeting that decided, the trustees decided to accept the town's offer was held at Arniston House, the Lord President's country seat, on the 21st of September 1769. And the Clarke Register was instructed immediately to employ persons of skill to draw plans. So we've already just touched on the construction of the Register House, 1774, foundation stone, a stoppage in 1779 for lack of funds, resuming in 1785. In 1788, the building was completed as the South Range and halfway along the East and West Ranges, and that was already agreed by the 1772 contract. So it was another 30 years before the back half of the building was completed to the same plan or layout, but not precisely the same design. In records started to be brought in, as we've mentioned, and the clerks of the Court of Session, the Sacian's office, the Chancery, the Privy Seal, the Justiciary occupied their offices arranged around the outside of the building, just as envisaged in the Morton Baldwin design. So we could say in conclusion that Register House is arguably the best thing to emerge from the Jacobite Rising of the 45, and it demonstrates, if nothing else, the long struggle to create a home for Scotland's public records. It is surely evidence of the huge importance attached to the project. It was at once the fulfilment of Lord Morton's vision and the achievement of a long-sought public good. Creating a secure, purpose-built home for the nation's records was the product of enlightened thinking, and it could even be argued that by housing an important institution that was crucial to the preservation of the private rights of citizens and the operation of the law, that Register House, as it arose from the 1770s onwards, embodied a key aspect of a modern civil society. However, perhaps precisely because it addressed a practical need in a practical way, certainly with an architectural flourish, but without huge fanfare, that Register House has largely escaped attention as a phenomenon of the Scottish Enlightenment. Thank you very much.